cover the general conditions under which it's necessary to retain this idea of a thick present. First of all, as I've said throughout, there's no need to assume either a grid time of abstract or regular succeeding instants, or a space of any regular dimensionality. In terms of space, the concept of the thick present is entailed by even the simplest form of space, any list of located events and a list of neighborhoods of those located events, such that they're not all the same for all events. In terms of time, the concept of a thick present is entailed by the notion that links require finite real time to travel from one event to another, and those times differ for different other events. As long as we believe that the world consists of events with neighborhoods defining some kind of non-trivial adjacency, and also believe that consequential links take more time to travel to some events than to others, we are obliged to conceive of the present as thick. Those are very general conditions met by nearly any social system we could imagine. Second, there's no need to assume that links propagate in some uniform manner. Figure 1 is very uniform. There's no need to assume that every event sends links forward to every adjacent event. Some systems are characterized by highly regular links. The number of 25-year-olds this year in the United Kingdom is linked quite directly to the number of 24-year-olds last year, the number of 26-year-olds next year. Other adjacency systems might be quite different, have tightly organized little bits with very few links between them. Nor is it really necessary to assume anything rigid about generations of events. Figure 1 seemed to show regular clock tactus in a sense, but it's events themselves that constitute the passage of time. And while we don't want to think of events as having roots in the deep past, we should see that the immediate past from which the links do come is itself a thick period, indefinite but finite, just like the thick present. In abandoning the assumption of regular clock time, we've created a system in which what matters is relative time. What is important about this or that link or sequence of links is whether it moves faster or slower than some other, not whether it moves fast or slow in some absolute sense. It is relative time, for example, that's involved in globalization. Globalization rearranges the adjacencies, what's close to what, so that things like contacting a colleague in another country no longer take a different time from contacting one at home. In fact, sometimes it's faster. What matters is not how fast I can contact them absolutely, but which means of contact are faster than others. In the old days, I might have written careful and well-argued letters to colleagues, full of forethought about their possible reactions to what I was writing, whereas now I fire off quick and thoughtless emails. Probably I achieve the same clarity in the same length of calendar time, but I achieve it by many more actual exchanges and many fewer carefully thought out internally modeled ones. Note that this example implies that one of the effects of email, texting, and so on is to make the personality less an internalization of others and more a simple emanation of solipsism. The change happens because there's no longer so great a difference between the relative time of contacts with others as with the self. Our students have, of course, taken this to the infinite limit by living in so booming and buzzing a world of Twitter, texts, and feeds that they actually have very little connection with their own Bergsonian double. They are, in fact, more familiar with others than with themselves. The same importance of relative time holds for the stock market. What matters is not so much that we trade stock faster than ever before, but that the rate of stock trading has greatly increased relative to the rate of new information about the companies traded. If information had somehow kept pace, we wouldn't be watching stock bubbles and crashes. Another consequence of jettisoning the assumptions of fixed space and clock time is that there's no possibility of empty space or time. Since social time consists simply of the flow of events, there is no possibility of a time in which nothing happens. Such time as Aristotle observed could not in any case be known. Similarly, the topology of the social world consists of all the various links between events. These links, in fact, constitute all of social space. There is no deeper space within which they're located. They are the space. There is no empty social space. Empty time and space, of course, do exist in the social process, vacancies, structural holes, failed performances, and so on. But all of those holes exist at the macrocosmic level of entities, not at the microcosmic level of events. This denial of empty time reminds us of a subtle misimpression produced by diagrams like Figure 1. Because of the way we draw such diagrams, the implicit image is of a network flowing through time, sometimes connected and sometimes not. But the reality is that had a certain event had more links coming into it, it would have been a different event. There are no fixed positions. There are only lineages of events and neighborhoods defined by chains of links. Holes, as I said, exist only at the macro level, between lineages that have become stabilities. Another important characteristic of locality is that it is tensed. That is, locality has a direction. Were we to separate time and space, as in the traditional analysis, one would be tensed, and the other would not. The concept of locality combines time and space, and since time is tensed, locality too is tensed. It is this truth that is caught so perfectly in the title of the novel, You Can't Go Home Again. You can't go home again because when you do, you aren't the you for whom what was there was home, and moreover, home is not today the same as what was there when home was your home. You aren't you anymore, and home isn't home anymore. Indeed, one might read Thomas Wolfe's title as underscoring a central theme of the present argument, that persons and even localities are both events. Ironically, the book itself illustrates the way things are actually lineages of events, because the manuscript that we read today as the book You Can't Go Home Again was actually created by the editor Maxwell Perkins out of the much different manuscript October Fair that Thomas Wolfe actually left at the time he died. A final property of locality is its over-inclusive and overarching character. In discussing the thickness of the present, we saw the possibility of nested presents, each including within it a range of smaller presents. But we can also consider this, which is sort of the Bergsonian version of the present. We see an event where the single dot in the middle, and around it a zillion different presents, in some of which the dot kind of comes at the end, and some of which it comes to the middle, and some of which it comes way out on the edge, and so on and so forth. Figure 4 shows some of the many presents of which a focal event might be taken as a part. Some are small, some large, some centered, some not. There's an extraordinary multiplicity of layers of locality. It's not a tiling of the space and exhaustive classification, it's rather like many overlaid layers of fish scales at many different sizes and relative positions. This multiple and overlapping quality of locality represents the many overlapping layers of spatial and temporal experiences in the social process. So when we actually try to think about explaining a real social event, now you're coming to, we're going to come, and damn, it's sideways. Well, it's the way it goes. Can someone tell me how to rotate this? Is some genius who can rotate it? It's funny. Right. Basically, what you're going to see, this is why my dissertation didn't get published. That's what this figure 5 is actually about. And I'm just going to set the text aside because it's easier to just talk to. There it is. This is why my dissertation did not get published. My dissertation was an attempt to explain why there are no psychiatrists in American mental hospitals. And I discovered that I actually wrote 4 completely separate explanations of why this was true. One was, well, people made individual decisions year to year to leave or not to leave. That's those little tiny triangles, the diamonds in the middle. Psychiatrists saying, I'm going to leave the hospital this year, I'm not going to leave the hospital. Another explanation was based on the emergence of larger communities of psychiatrists on an outpatient basis in major cities on the East Coast, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and so on. Those things took about 10 years to get going. And they're sort of these next size of diamonds, which you see overlap with these small diamonds, but they're kind of bigger. There are 4 of them going across. But I had another explanation, which was based on changes in knowledge, the shift from an organic psychiatry to kind of psychological psychiatry. That took about 50 years gradually. And you can think about organic psychiatry as kind of one big diamond over here, and the new psychological psychiatry as the second big diamond over there. You see it sort of overlaps. And then indeed, the 4th part of the dissertation, the one out of which the book system of professions came, was about a gradual change in social control and needs for social control in society, and that's the kind of big outside thing that isn't even finished. What I didn't know at the time was how to write this up. But in a sense, what you see is that as we go across the Newtonian present, at any given time, a whole bunch of these things are all going on at once. Because the present is all that exists, all of those things can affect each other all at once. So in a sense, what I should have done was to have narrated each process separately and then tried to assemble them back together. But if I'd had this idea 30 years ago, I might have published my dissertation. I'll stop there.
Right. Thank you. That was very exciting and mind-expanding. the way we're going to do this is Julie McLeod will discuss, we will discuss it and just provide us with a bridge. Yeah? A tentative bridge. A tentative bridge between our conversations.
Okay. I'll just to give it informally, I know it's a long time of listening. So I really feel that I've got a pretty easy job today to respond to that paper. And having read it completely out of being rather stepping outside my comfort zone. So thank you, Andrew, for the publications. I agreed to do this paper some time ago, act as a discussant, being quite intrigued by the provocation to reconceive the object of qualitative longitudinal research. And that question is one that has stayed with me, one that I haven't really been able to answer to my own satisfaction, having done some qualitative longitudinal research myself and feeling fairly confident about what I thought that object was. And I want to return to that question towards the end of my comments following Andrew's presentation today, which I want to begin, which I hope in the spirit of Andrew's work, and say something about the experience of reading this paper as a way into responding to his arguments about locality, the event, and the thick and present, and what that might mean in relation to qualitative longitudinal research. This way of beginning the paper is in fact in part prompted by another paper that Andrew has written and which is listed in the topics for further reading, which is Against Narrative, a Preface to Lyrical Sociology, in which Andrew argues for a sociology and forms of sociological writing that can recreate, quote, an experience of social discovery and forms calling upon and addressing the emotional imagination, not only the theoretical imagination. The latter, he argues, being one of the mainstays of much sociology, producing, he fears, colourless imaginations and plodding moralism. So suitably cautioned, I'll begin. We've been experiencing, I've just flown over from Melbourne, we've been experiencing a late summer heat wave in Melbourne, across Australia really, days on end with temperatures well into the mid-30s and nights not much cooler. Sleep is broken, people's nerves are frayed, the city holds on to the heat and time feels out of sync. And this year especially, there is a deadening sense that this heat wave, this exception, is in fact the new normal. On one such day, after reading Andrew's paper during this bizarre heat, I went to a play that night at the Melbourne Theatre Company called Constellations by a British playwright, Nick Payne, a much praised young playwright who last year won the Best Play at the Evening Standards Award for this script. The play dramatises the idea of multiple universes, many worlds of possibilities and parallel lives, the might have beens and the also have beens, and the time and events being played out in their multiple possibilities. It tells the story, or perhaps more accurately the stories, of Marianne, a quantum physicist, and Roland, a beekeeper, and their love, or perhaps not, across the multiverse. In one 65-minute act, we experience every possible iteration of their relationship. They meet at a party when Roland is still in a relationship, or just out of a really serious relationship, or he's married, or he's single, and their first date goes horribly, or pretty well, and almost kind of fizzles, and then they sleep together, or they don't, and so on. Every possibility plays out in front of us. As Marianne explains on at least one version of one of their first dates, quote from the play, every choice, every decision we've ever and never made exists in an unimaginably vast ensemble of parallel universes. But if and then a little bit later on she adds, but if every possible future exists, then the decisions we do and don't make will determine which of these futures we actually end up experiencing. In the final scenes of the play, and in the series of parallel possibilities, in which Marianne is and is not diagnosed with brain tumour, she lives, she dies, she euthanizes, she accepts. She says to Roland in the end, the basic laws of physics don't have a past and a present. Time is irrelevant at the level of atoms and molecules. It's symmetrical. We have all the time we have always had. You'll still have all our time. There's not going to be any more or less of it once I'm gone. So this meditation on time, on duration, biographical time, the lived moment, passing time and the present, seemed uncannily timely, given that I was about to do that whole time-space thing, take myself to another country to think about duration and the dynamic temporalities of qualitative longitudinal research, and what that might be trying to capture, and how Andrew's arguments about the present might speak to that endeavour. In the comments then that follow, and they are very tentative and uncertain to say the least, they are informed by my own experience of forays into QLR and my more recent experiences of conducting oral history interviews with former teachers and students in Australia from the 1930s to the 1970s. And I confess, some persistent confusion and ambivalence about trying to grapple with the time-space relationship. No matter how much I read, it still seems quite elusive to me to really work out what these arguments mean, not only conceptually, but how to enact them empirically and methodologically. So I'm going to identify a couple of concepts and ideas across the paper that emerged for me as rich ones to explore in our debates today and in my own work. And one is the notion of encoding, the way in which the immediate past is encoded. The other is the issue of the thickened present. And finally, thinking about what these arguments mean for QLR and for methodology. Andrew makes, I think, for me it was a very important distinction between the longer past and the immediate past. And as someone who has been rather invested in oral histories and memory, it was very challenging to have that way of thinking about the way the past is a sort of permanent trace or a sort of ongoing trace, that more dynamic relationship with the present. So I was quite intrigued by this notion of encoding, and the models of it and the various models as well started to add to this sense of it. On the one hand, it seems quite an effective explanation of how the past is made, or the immediate past is made sense in the present. But I think the challenge for when we're thinking about that issue in qualitative research is how that is actually happening. And it seemed to me, this is a question to discuss really, the explanation is quite neat, and I'm interested in the ways in which a lot of the work, the methodologists interested in sort of the mess, in an entanglement, what happens, how the sort of ambivalences and the experience, a subjective dimension of that encoding process, and what actually is involved in encoding. It seemed to me to condense and distill a very complex process of how individuals and generations work out that relationship between the immediate past and the present. And partly thinking from the earlier presentation this morning in the discussion about the futures in planning, the way in which anticipation of the future might become part of, how we might begin to think of that as part of that encoding process. So the encoding is not only with the immediate past, but with an anticipation towards the future and how that is played out in the thickened present. I was also struck by the rather bold asserted argument of Andrew's that the past is gone. It isn't like a ghost in the machine influencing the present. And it brought to mind what has been a very influential article for me by Harry Haratunian, where he writes similarly about the thickened present. And Haratunian writes, following Edmund Husserl, about the thickened present, is that this is a present filled with traces of different moments and temporalities, weighted with sediments. He referred to the comet's tail of retention that managed to retain their identity long after the inaugurating event has passed. In this regard, history is not only the locus of uneven rhythms, the collision of coexisting temporalities and difference, it is also the scene where the ghosts of the past commingle daily with the living, a little like the habitants of a haunted house. And he concludes by referring to the messiness of these always colliding temporalities. So I've been trying to think through how these arguments about colliding temporalities and the sort of mess that produces add to or unsettle or complicate the argument both that Andrew's proposed in relation to the living present and the way in which a lot of qualitative longitudinal research proceeds when it anticipates or looks to the way in which the past interacts with subjects in the present. The final set of comments are about things that I would like to know more about from the paper. One is the reference to the minimal present and the responses to that by other, we call Foucault historian and philosopher. So Bradel or Foucault embed single events within a giant present. Andrew concludes that they're not right or wrong, but simply different ways of handling the problem of telling a complex social process. And for myself, I find it quite interesting to tease out some more about why Andrew adopted the approach he has, and not the other, what his view is on that more genealogical or Foucauldian approach. Finally, it's how we approach the question of contexts in the way in which we conceptualise the present and the object of qualitative longitudinal research. Clearly, it seems to me that how we see these debates is obviously shaped by the disciplinary and methodological traditions and practices that have shaped those orientations. In my own case, I currently work in the School of Education. I try to understand how processes of inequality take place, interactions between subjective experience and institutional experience. And I've been profoundly influenced by debates within feminist theory. One of the early prompts to undertaking a qualitative longitudinal project was as a response to some of the more abstracted accounts of subjectivity, and I wanted to try and explore what that looked like in process, how subjectivity was actually formed and embodied historically located young people as they went through school. Andrew obviously comes from a quite different tradition, and his debate with historical sociology, I think, is declares in the beginning, and it's one that comes through the paper all the way, I would say. Challenge, and particularly that separation, the way in which sort of the long determinism of history against that more immediate past. For me, it did challenge me, being quite outside my normal mode of thinking, to think anew about whether and how qualitative longitudinal research might or does or should be investigating this moment of encoding, and if we are doing that, what do we call it, and what does it look like for researchers in this field, and in particular how to take up that challenge of symmetric asynchronicity, which in the written paper he sort of urges us to take up as one of the key challenges for research in this area. And the final point is, and returning to the provocation of the play that I mentioned, is how we deal with the contingencies and the sense of futures that the play provoked, of disrupting investments in memory in the past as the source, as another source to think about qualitative research in the present.
We're running a bit late in our programme. We could take a little bit of time. What I don't want to think is this is the only time to talk back to Andrew about his paper, and I think that's something that can go on across the day. But we could take a couple of comments now before we break for lunch, and we'll have a slightly shorter lunch break so that we can manage the programme. I'm not going to invite you to respond to this quote. I think we can do that later in the day. Lots to digest, but any sort of contributions, Michelle?
Yeah, thank you. It's really nice to be able to, with my background in philosophy, it's very nice to hear sort of an approach to time that's not treating it, talking about social time and treating it as multiple, because I find a lot of philosophers treat it quite, forget all the social aspects of time. So that was really useful. But I mean, I guess, sorry to do the but, I guess I was kind of concerned about this idea of the event, and I thought there was a conflation going on maybe between different types of events, and particularly coming out of the tradition in continental philosophy, I guess, where the event, you can have sort of everyday events, but the event is what breaks all those links in time that you were sort of talking about. So I was sort of wondering about how things like trauma, or that experience of where actually all your past and your future sort of falls away from you when you don't have those things. I mean, I know that there was sort of discussion about that it takes time to make links between the future, but I kind of there's also I sort of didn't see where that idea of breaking, and that you don't, when you're trying to make these reconnections, they can be quite different from anything you were sort of next to before, or sort of how do those kinds of things happen, that dislocation and disjointedness.
Might I hold on to that? Can I take a couple of points?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have time to formulate this a bit better, but I'm just wondering how you address that kind of issue that certain sociologists had with historical sociology about, I'm addressing here this idea that the deep past is gone, around objects, and the past being about relics, and how you locate that kind of argument. There is no deep past, but there are relics, there are material objects. Now, do they only come into social life as an immediate antecedent to some form of dealing with it as a relationship in that moment? And then how does that play out in the way in which certain types of social philosophy have decided that material objects are also actors?
Okay. That's quite a lot, isn't it? Should we? That's not a lot. Okay.
It's straightforward.
Okay. Is there another? I think he's provoked now to a killer question, Alan.
I'd just like to ask a question about how you would empirically explore encoding. Not quite sure what I think encoding amounts to that would be relevant to an empirical investigation. How define what was encoded?
Okay, I think that's three really nice questions. So, would you like to?
Sure, it's pretty, this is one of these things where, I've written lots of different things in lots of different places, and so for most of these questions, I feel like I've kind of answered them somewhere. So the issue of what about big changes versus little changes? The second problem is to try to figure out how we get, obviously in historical sociology, one problem is to figure out how to get explanations of big changes. And one of the only ways to do that is to get out of the notion that big changes are somehow unusual and there's always kind of everyday change, which is just sort of like errors in the machine, and then every now and then the whole thing goes crazy. So I think I've discussed this in my paper on turning points. The fact about big changes is that big changes are very often possible, but most of the big changes that could happen don't happen. So that's because one of the aspects of social structure, when I say that if you say that a larger social structure appears to be stable, what you really mean is that there are processes, there are relationships in it which make it kind of unlikely for major change to occur. But it could be the case that a whole bunch of aspects of social structure line up the way tumblers line up in a lock, and if somebody puts the key in the lock and turns it, bang, you get a big change. So, for example, I would argue that the Soviet Union could have fallen apart several times before it did. Nobody happened to see that this was the moment that you could actually push at this point and the door would open because everything was kind of lined up that way. Even the biggest aspects of the self are on the line every instant, in every moment of life. Now, as I said, the great problem with processual sociology is to explain why it is that most of the time life appears kind of stable and we go on and we have this notion of the big change, the big change. But had a routine operation and got an email back from the guy and said, yeah, it should be fine, you should be able to urinate a whole lot easier now, but 3 out of the 15 chips we took out had cancer, Gleason stage 7, you probably should call somebody next week. So there's a moment before you get that email, there's a moment after you got that email. But you could get that email anytime, and suddenly I want to understand, then you change it, and you deal with life and so on and so forth. But the point is that the great stabilities of the world are always at risk, all the time. Most of the time, it doesn't so happen that they become unstable and the big events don't occur. But it's always possible. All institutions are always fording the river of possibility, the river of chance. And the only way you can allow for the possibility of these giant changes is exactly to have everything at risk all the time. Then you have to explain why it is that most of the time no big events happen, because that is the observed fact. So that's the kind of general answer to the first question, to the issue of what about the big events? The answer is it's always possible to have big events, but most of the time we don't, and the explanatory burden on me is to figure out why that would be the case. So the problem is then to explain how it is that the social structure of the immediate past is mostly organized in such a way that, well, if you push on this part, something else will come back and kind of close it off. But it also assumes that, sometimes things kind of line up and then somebody takes an action and makes it better. So that's the first thing, and I refer you to my article on turning points, which is in Time Matters, and it's published somewhere else as well, because that develops a search key in a lot of theory. Now about the relics of the past, the material objects, and so on and so forth. So I've written about encoding, this old chapter on encoding in this book, which is also been written for 10 years. The place where I've written the most about encoding is in an article in the chapter in the second edition of the Handbook of Economic Sociology on the sociology of occupations, work and occupations. Because one of the things I realized there is that if you're talking about the resources, for example, available to a generation when it retires, it has to do with their financial status at present is a record of what happened to them in their lives. The people who in the United States served in the Second World War came out into a wonderful economy. They had a certain set of experiences in that wonderful economy. They had therefore had the direction of having gone from being children in the Depression to this sort of wonderful, huge, wonderful thing. They experience a certain set of things. That means they have certain kinds of resources when they retire. Other later cohorts have completely different sets of resources and completely different senses of what the trajectory of life is. The trajectory of the people who are Depression children was, hey, things are generally getting better and better. That's their experience. Well, the trajectory of my generation is things move steadily to the right and they get worse and worse. So that's a different kind of experience. But I think the thing about relics is that in order to be here to have influence today, the relics have to survive. The point about relics is they have to last. Whether they're documents, they have to be preserved in libraries. It's not just because we have these relics from the past. They happen to be the ones we have. We could have totally different ones. We have certain buildings that are still standing. Somebody just told me that there's this big construction hole out there, which used to be a very famous Manchester building, right? BBC, right? It's gone. It's no longer a relic. It's a hole. It's going to be a new thing. So the thing about relics and physical stuff is they too have to be preserved moment to moment. They have to be maintained moment to moment. You can't suddenly recreate the past. The way, an example that really gives you a powerful way to think about encoding is the following. Because I invented the concept of encoding because I wanted to get away from the obvious true fact, which is overwhelming, that of course huge amounts of memory and so on are written into people's minds, into records, into all kinds of things. So of course it's easy to see the past as having an influence that way. But I wanted to have an influence of the past that also to realize that there was an influence of the past that was somehow written into social structure. Here's the example. If you're a French woman of marriageable age in the 1920s, you don't get married. Why? Because there's nobody to marry. Why is there nobody to marry? Because a million Frenchmen died in the First World War. There's just nobody there. So if you look at marriage rates in France and Germany, actually throughout Britain, throughout Europe in that period, you'll find this plummet. And also huge changes in the family structure. Why? Because this fact of There being no man is written into the demographic structure and continues on and on and on and on. My generation is going to have hard times getting into the nursing homes of its choice. Why? Because I'm at the head end of the baby boom. There are lots of us. And just as we had a hard time getting this and that and the other jobs and so on, we're going to have a hard time getting into nursing homes because there's so many of us. We're going to have trouble selling our houses. Why? Because there's a very small generation behind us. There are fewer 50-year-olds in the United States, fewer 45-year-olds than there are 60-year-olds. The United States age distribution is actually like that. It's simply written into the population demography, and it will never change. It's an automatic experience. So there's nobody for us to sell our houses to, so of course there's going to be a further housing crash in the United States. It's kind of given. So the fact that the notion about encoding is to envision things like that nobody does anything about, but they're simply written into the existing nature of things that go on and on, continue to have causal effects throughout time, even though there's no sort of cultural mediation, they're not written down, they're not remembered, and so on and so forth. Now, it is also the case that memory and written documents and so on in the past, in that sense, the preserved stuff of the past that you've asked about. Of course, that stuff is centrally important. It's also true that it's being centrally rewritten all the time. So what those past documents that we have about the 19th century, think about Mansfield Park. The novel Mansfield Park. People spent the first half of the 20th century writing stuff about Jane Austen and her life and so on and so forth. What has most of the writing been about Mansfield Park for the last, in the last 20, 30 years? It's about racism, about Sir Thomas's estates in Antigua, blah, blah, blah. But that's what people see in Mansfield Park now as a novel. That's what they're interested in. The novel stayed the same, new set of interests. It's always the interests of the present that decide what it is that we see in the past, what we make of the past. And there, what we have is, as you say, exactly the materials that are the stuff that make up the history. And we kind of rewrite them. Now, all of us actually deep down do think that there kind of was a Newtonian past and